Imagine a sound so terrifying that it makes hardened combat veterans beg their officers for permission to cover their ears. Imagine an entire army of 1,000 elite soldiers vanishing from the face of the earth in a single night without a single bomb being dropped. The date is February 19th, 1945. The place is a remote island off the coast of Burma. Just after midnight, the British Royal Navy sailors anchored offshore heard a sound that did not belong to war. It wasn't the boom of artillery. It wasn't the rattle of machine guns. It was a continuous, rising scream coming from the blackness of the mangrove swamp. One sailor later described it as the sound of the earth itself, eating men alive. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the screaming had stopped. The silence was absolute, and the water flowing out of the swamp had turned a thick, dark red. What happened in those 6 hours of darkness? How does a fully armed battalion of the Imperial Japanese Army simply disappear? Was it a secret British weapon? Was it mass suicide? Or was it something far older and far deadlier than any human army? Today, we declassify the Ramree Island massacre, the night nature took its revenge. To understand this nightmare, we first have to solve mystery number 1. Why did they enter the trap? Why would 1,000 experienced soldiers walk voluntarily into a swamp that local maps labeled as the place of no return? The answer lies in the psychology of the Japanese commander, General Kenichi Nagasawa. It is early 1945. The British 14th Army is crushing the Japanese forces in Burma. Ramree Island is the key. It is a strategic choke point needed for airfields. The battle for the island has been brutal. For weeks, the British and Japanese have fought hand-to-hand in the jungle. But now, the Japanese garrison is surrounded. The British have cut off the supply lines. They have surrounded the main town. General Nagasawa stands on a ridge looking east. He has 2 choices. Choice 1, surrender. But for a samurai, surrender is not an option. It is a spiritual death. It brings shame upon his family for generations. Choice 2, break out. But the only route out of the encirclement is a 10-mile stretch of tidal mangrove swamp, a place where the mud is waist-deep and the trees grow out of black sludge. Military logic says the swamp is impassable, but Nagasawa operates on the logic of the spirit. He believes his men can endure anything. He looks at the dark, twisted tree line of the swamp and sees a road to freedom. He orders his men to prepare. He does not know that he is not ordering a retreat. He is ringing a dinner bell. The retreat begins at dusk. 1,000 men. They are the elite 54th Division. They are carrying rifles, machine guns, and wounded comrades on stretchers. They step off the solid ground and into the mud. Immediately, the nightmare begins. The mud in a mangrove swamp is not like normal earth. It is a mixture of clay, rotting vegetation, and water. It creates a suction. Every step requires a massive physical effort. Slurp, suck, drag. Within the first hour, the column slows to a crawl. Men are sinking up to their chests. They have to hold their rifles over their heads to keep them dry. But the mud is only the first layer of the trap. The second layer is the water. The swamp is tidal. This means the water level isn't constant. As the moon rises, so does the tide. The water creeps up, inch by inch, silently. Men who are walking on mud banks suddenly find themselves swimming in black, brackish water. Then comes the biology. The swamp is alive. Clouds of mosquitoes, millions of them, descend on the soldiers. In the tropical heat, the insects are attracted to the sweat and the open wounds of the soldiers. They bite the eyelids, the ears, the lips. Men scream and slap their faces, but there are too many. Then come the scorpions, hiding in the hollows of the mangrove roots, and the spiders, as big as a human hand. The soldiers are fighting a war on a microscopic level. They are being eaten alive by insects, but they keep moving because they believe the British are behind them. They do not realize that the British have stopped chasing them. The British commander has ordered his ships to simply wait at the exit. He knows he doesn't need to fight them. He knows what lives in the heart of the swamp. Now we arrive at the true horror of this story, the monster. Ramree Island is not just an island. It is the perfect habitat for Crocodilus pyrosus, the saltwater crocodile. You might think you know what a crocodile is, but the saltwater crocodile is not like the ones you see in a zoo. It is the largest reptile on the planet. An adult male can grow to 23 feet long and weigh more than 2,000 pounds. That is the weight of a small car. It is a dinosaur that refused to die. Evolution crafted it for one purpose: the ambush. How does a crocodile hunt in pitch-black water? This is the engineering marvel of the beast. Along its jawline, it has thousands of tiny black dots called integumentary sensory organs. These are pressure sensors. They are so sensitive that a crocodile can detect the heartbeat of a fish from 10 feet away. It does not need to see you. It can feel you, shivering in the water. The Japanese soldiers were bleeding. Weeks of combat had left them with open wounds. Blood dripped into the water. In the ocean, blood attracts sharks. In the swamp, blood travels through the currents, carrying a chemical signal that every predator understands. It signals weakness. It signals food. Deep in the mudbanks, the ancient reptiles awoke. They slid silently into the water. Not one, not 10, but hundreds, perhaps thousands. The entire ecosystem of the island began to migrate toward the column of struggling men. The sun sets completely. The swamp goes pitch black. The canopy of the trees blocks out the starlight. The Japanese soldiers turn on small flashlights, but quickly turn them off, fearing British snipers. They are blind. They hold on to the belt of the man in front of them, stumbling over roots. Then the first scream tears the night apart. At the rear of the column, a soldier suddenly vanishes. There is no gunshot, just a splash, a violent thrashing sound, like a paddle hitting the water, and then a gurgling cry that is cut short. The men around him stop. They shine a light. The water is rippling, but the man is gone. They think he slipped into a sinkhole. They pull each other closer. 10 minutes later, it happens again. This time, the soldier has time to scream a word: "Wani! Crocodile!" The man next to him feels something rough and hard brush against his leg. It feels like a floating log, but logs don't have scales. He looks down, and in the beam of his flashlight, he sees two glowing yellow orbs reflecting the light. The tapetum lucidum, the reflective layer in the crocodile's eye that gives it perfect night vision. The eyes blink, and then the water explodes. The crocodile attacks with a maneuver physicists call the death roll. It clamps its jaws onto a limb with a force of 3,700 pounds per square inch. That is enough force to crush steel. Then it tucks its legs and spins its entire body. The torque generated tears bone from socket and flesh from bone. To the soldier standing nearby, it sounds like wet laundry being ripped apart. The water turns into a frothing mix of mud and blood. Panic is a virus. It spreads instantly. The soldiers try to run, but you cannot run in waist-deep mud. When you try to run, you get stuck. You splash more. You create more vibration. And vibration attracts more crocodiles. The predators are now in a frenzy. They are coming from the banks. They are coming from the deep channels. They are snatching men from the roots of the trees. The Japanese soldiers fight back. They are brave men. They fire their machine guns blindly into the water. The muzzle flashes light up the swamp in strobe effects, revealing glimpses of the horror. Massive jaws snapping, tails whipping, men being dragged under. They throw grenades into the water. The explosions kill some of the reptiles, but the smell of exploded reptile meat mixed with the scent of dead human only drives the remaining crocodiles into a madness of hunger. It is a biological chain reaction.
The British sailors anchored miles away listened to this. They are tough men. They have seen ships sink. They have seen cities burn. But they have never heard this. The sound is continuous. It is a low roar of agony, interspersed with the high-pitched cracks of snapping bone. Some of the sailors ask permission to fire star shells, flares to light up the swamp. They want to see. Or perhaps they want the crocodiles to stop. But the orders are strict. Maintain the blockade. The swamp is doing the work for us. Inside the swamp, the Japanese command structure collapses. Officers shout orders that no one hears. The only order is survival. Men climb the mangrove trees, desperately trying to get out of the water. But the mangroves are slippery. The roots are covered in slime. Men slip and fall back into the water, where the jaws are waiting. Some tie themselves to the branches with their belts to keep from falling if they pass out from exhaustion. But sleep is impossible. Below them, the water is churning, with hundreds of reptiles fighting over the bodies of their friends. Imagine the psychological horror. You are clinging to a tree in the pitch black. Below you, you can hear the feeding. You can hear the breathing of the monsters waiting for you to fall. You know that your flashlight batteries are dying. You know that the tide is rising, bringing the water level closer to your feet. And you know that there are 10 miles of this between you and safety. This is not war. This is the primal fear of the species, the fear of being eaten.
The sun rose over Ramree Island on February 20th, 1945, like a bloodshot eye. The mist that clung to the mangroves all night begins to lift, revealing a scene that looks less like a battlefield and more like a slaughterhouse. The British patrol boats, which had maintained their blockade in the open water, slowly moved closer to the mudbanks. The sailors stood on the decks with handkerchiefs pressed tightly over their noses and mouths. The smell of the swamp was overpowering. It was a thick, cloying stench of rotting vegetation, gunpowder, and death. As the boats drifted silently through the brown water, the crew began to see the aftermath. The water was churning, not with crocodiles anymore, but with scavengers. Vultures circled overhead in the hundreds, blotting out the sun like a dark cloud. In the water, huge monitor lizards and crabs were feeding on what the crocodiles had left behind. But it was the silence that disturbed the British soldiers the most. There was no enemy fire. There were no shouts of defiance. There was only the wet slapping sound of water against the roots. And then they noticed the color of the river. The water itself has turned a deep, dark red. The British officers scanned the tree line with binoculars. They were looking for 1,000 men. They found nothing but debris. Helmets floating upside down, rifles stuck barrel first in the mud, backpacks shredded as if by heavy machinery. How does an entire army vanish in a single night without fighting a single battle? What could possibly kill 980 men in 6 hours, leaving no survivors to bury the dead? The naturalist Bruce Wright, who was on one of the lead boats, wrote a sentence in his diary that has terrified historians for decades. The crocodiles had done their work well. The British boats moved slowly into the mangroves, expecting an ambush. Instead, they found ghosts. Out of the 1,000 men who entered the darkness, only 20 were found alive. Just 20. That is a survival rate of 2%.
These men were not soldiers anymore. They were broken shells. When the British Marines pulled them out of the mud, the Japanese soldiers did not resist. They did not try to fight. They did not even try to speak. They simply stared into the distance, their eyes wide and empty. They were covered in mud, blood, and slime. Their uniforms were shredded, exposing wounds that were already turning gangrenous in the heat. Many of them had bite marks on their legs and arms, terrifying evidence of close encounters they had miraculously survived. One survivor was found clinging to the top of a mangrove tree. He had tied himself to the trunk with his leather belt. He was dehydrated, shaking with fever, and covered in thousands of insect bites. When the British shouted to him, he didn't respond. He couldn't. He had been hanging there for 8 hours, listening to the screams of his comrades being torn apart below. His mind had simply shut down to protect him from the horror. The British sailors had to climb up and cut him down like a piece of fruit. Another group of 3 survivors was found huddled on a small mud bank that was completely surrounded by water. They were holding their rifles, but they had no ammunition left. They had used every bullet they had shooting at the water. They were shivering violently, not from cold, but from terror. When they were brought on board the British ship, they refused to go near the railing. They were terrified of the water. They had developed an instant and profound phobia of the liquid that had almost consumed them. When the medics examined these 20 survivors, they found injuries that made no sense in modern warfare. There were no bullet holes. There were no shrapnel wounds. Instead, there were crush injuries, femurs snapped in half by massive pressure, deep lacerations that looked like they were made with saw blades. Infection had set in almost instantly due to the virulent bacteria found in a crocodile's mouth. The British doctors realized they weren't treating war wounds, they were treating bite marks from the Jurassic period. For decades, the Battle of Ramree Island has been listed in the Guinness Book of World Records as the greatest disaster suffered from animals. The official number cited is that 980 men were eaten by crocodiles. However, in recent years, historians and scientists have asked a difficult question. Could crocodiles really eat that many people in one night? Skeptics argue that the population of crocodiles on the island couldn't support such a massacre. They argue that a crocodile eats only once a week. They suggest that many Japanese soldiers likely died of dehydration, drowning, or British gunfire before the crocodiles got to them. They suggest that perhaps only a few hundred were eaten, and the rest died of natural causes in the swamp. But even if the number is exaggerated, the horror remains the same. Whether it was 500 men or 900 men, it was a massacre of unprecedented scale. But biology tells a darker story. Saltwater crocodiles are territorial, but they are also opportunistic. When a massive food source enters the water, it triggers a biological phenomenon known as a feeding frenzy. The scent of blood travels for miles. It overrides territorial instincts. Predators migrate from the entire estuary to join the feast. In a feeding frenzy, crocodiles will kill far more than they can eat immediately. Furthermore, crocodiles have a unique behavior called caching. If they are not hungry, they do not stop killing. They kill the prey and then tuck the bodies under submerged logs or into underwater caves to rot. They store the meat for later. The swamp wasn't just a dining table. It was a pantry. The sheer volume of missing men suggests that the crocodiles were not just eating, they were stockpiling. What is indisputable is that a Japanese infantry division entered the swamp and it did not come out. The British did not shoot them all, they did not surrender, they vanished. And the only thing waiting for them in that 10-mile stretch of hell was the mosquitoes, the mud, and the crocodiles. The exact number of bites is irrelevant to the psychological impact of the event. It was a total erasure of a fighting force by the forces of nature. The Ramree Island massacre remains a stark reminder of a simple truth that modern warfare often forgets. Humans are not the masters of the earth. We build tanks. We build planes. We build bombs. We think we can conquer any terrain. But there are places on this planet where we do not belong. Places where the rules of civilization and technology do not apply. Places where we are not the top of the food chain. The Japanese army was one of the most disciplined and fearless fighting forces in history. They conquered China. They conquered the Philippines. They humiliated the British Empire in Singapore. But they were defeated by a swamp. They were defeated by biology. It is a humbling lesson. No matter how powerful your gun is, it cannot stop the tide. No matter how brave you are, you cannot fight an ecosystem. Today, Ramree Island is quiet. The mangroves are still there, twisting in the mud. The crocodiles are still there, lurking beneath the surface of the black water. If you go there today, the guides will tell you that the soil on the east bank is unusually fertile. They say it is because the land was fed by an army. There are no monuments to the men who died there. There are no white crosses in neat rows. Their grave is the swamp itself, and their epitaph is the silence of the jungle broken only by the splash of a tail. For the 20 men who survived, they carried the nightmare with them for the rest of their lives. They returned to Japan after the war, but many of them refused to speak about Ramree. How do you explain to your family that your battalion wasn't defeated by strategy or superior firepower, but by the food chain? How do you describe the sound of 1,000 men being hunted in the dark? They lived as ghosts, haunted by the memory of the night when the roles of hunter and prey were reversed. This was the Battle of Ramree Island, a battle where the winner wasn't the British Empire or the Empire of Japan. The winner was nature.